וההרצאה הזאת תהיה באנגלית, בהתנצלות. Much has been written on Aaron Lichtenstein's views on the significance of literature and general culture in religious life. Throughout his career, Rav Lichtenstein articulated a thoughtful and robust defense of the role that engagement with general culture, and especially literature, can play in enhancing one's religious life as a Jew. Yet while his engagement with literature is well known, what has been far less studied is the role that literary theory, and in particular the school of thought known as New Criticism, we just heard a little bit about it, but from a bit of a different angle, the role that New Criticism played in shaping his hermeneutics and interpretive practices, especially with regard to the study of religious Jewish texts, Tanakh, and Gemara. This paper seeks to fill that gap by exploring the intersection between Rav Lichtenstein's academic background in English literature and his distinctive approaches to religious learning. After completing his undergraduate studies, Rav Lichtenstein began doctoral work at Harvard's English department in 1953. He completed his dissertation in 1957, later published as Henry Moore, The Rational Theology of a Cambridge Platonist in 1962. Under the guidance of Professor Douglas Bush, who we heard a little bit about yesterday, he developed his scholarly expertise in the literary and philosophical thought of 17th century English writers. After earning his PhD, Rav Lichtenstein returned to Yeshiva University, where he learned and taught in Rietz. And even by 1962, he was already a rising star. It was clear he had a career in the yeshiva, while also being a professor of English in Stern College. Rav Lichtenstein's broad literary knowledge and humanistic training informed not only his writing and public lectures, but also his pedagogical method and vision of religious life. The literary references in his essays reflect an extensive engagement with the Western canon, ranging from Shakespeare to Eliot, Milton, many other classical poets and novelists. During the years of Rav Lichtenstein's graduate education, New Criticism was gaining traction as a dominant force in American literary theory. Originating in the early 20th century and peaking mid-century, New Criticism emphasized the close reading of texts, focusing on the language, form, and internal coherence of literary works, while minimizing the importance of historical context, authorial intent, and biographical background. Although Rav Lichtenstein never explicitly adopted the new critical framework in his published literary scholarship, I'll argue that elements of that approach are reflected in his methodological stance towards sacred texts, particularly in his rejection of historicism and emphasis on the internal logic and beauty of Torah. New Criticism emerged in response to earlier schools of literary study that prioritized biographical and historical contextualization in interpreting texts. The New Critics argued that a literary work should be understood as a self-contained, autonomous object whose meaning lies within its language, structure, and form. This movement was championed by figures such as Cleanth Brooks, John Crowe Ransom, I.A. Richard, William Wimsatt, and others who developed literary studies as a more systematic and analytic, even scientific discipline. Cleanth Brooks in particular advocated the idea that paraphrasing a poem inevitably distorts its meaning. In his essay, The Heresy of Paraphrase, he argued that the unity and richness of a poem derives from its complex interplay of ideas, imagery, and form. Meaning, in this view, meaning for him is not detachable from a work, but is rather something that emerges through close attention to the details of a text. The poem, like a living organism, must be appreciated holistically. Brooks and other New Critics believe that the aesthetic unity of a poem lives in the tension between competing ideas, resolved through the formal structure of the text itself. This approach had wide-ranging implications for the teaching of literature. In universities across the United States, New Criticism reoriented the curriculum around textual analysis and away from historical contextualization. Students were taught to engage with texts through techniques like close reading, attention to irony and ambiguity, and exploration of formal elements such as meter, diction, and syntax. New Criticism thus reshaped the goals and methods of literary education, making formal analysis the centerpiece of interpretive practice. So in what way did this literary theory, influential during Rav Lichtenstein's time in graduate school, impact his approach to reading text? As we heard in the previous talk, in the spring of 1962, Rav Lichtenstein delivered a lecture titled Criticism and Kitvei HaKodesh at Stern College, published only decades later in 2012. This lecture represents one of the clearest articulations of this literary approach to Tanakh, and offers strong evidence of a new critical influence, even if Rav Lichtenstein never actually uses that term in that essay. In the lecture, Rav Lichtenstein proposes that religious readers of Tanakh adopt the tools of literary criticism to deepen their understanding and appreciation of the biblical text. And this is a quote: I think it should be on the page. I propose that we strive to apply literary criticism to Ketvei HaKodesh, that we master its categories, familiar ourselves with its canons, and bring these to bear upon our reading, understanding, and appreciation of Tanakh. Rav Lichtenstein emphasizes recognizing archetypal forms, patterns of imagery, structural coherence, narrative development, and verbal texture. His method is grounded in a sensitivity to the text itself, echoing the methodological commitments of New Criticism. While distancing his position from biblical criticism, he endorses literary analysis that highlights the aesthetic and formal qualities of the biblical text. Rav Lichtenstein offers several reasons that motivate this approach. As we heard before, he highlights the intrinsic view of aesthetic experience, which aligns with New Criticism's views on literary beauty. He draws here a theological connection between the aesthetics, divine aesthetics in nature, appreciating God's creation, and those found in sacred texts. And third, he argues that appreciating a text's meaning requires engaging with its form and not only its propositional content. As he put it, power and beauty are of the very fabric of the pasuk's meaning. Such a statement closely parallels Cleanth Brooks' insistence about the heresy of paraphrase, right? That content and form are inseparable in literary interpretation. Rav Lichtenstein in this essay also addresses a possible skeptical attitude towards analysis, citing William Wordsworth's warning that we murder to dissect. But in response, he invokes none other than brisker tradition, which embraces rigorous analysis. And he argues that dissection does not preclude appreciation. When done properly, it can actually intensify one's appreciation for the text. Here, Rav Lichtenstein references, as we heard, Nechama Leibovitz and Meir Weiss as pioneers of this literary approach within the Israeli religious scene, both scholars who had trained within a new critical context, mostly through the European version of that, focused on close textual analysis, often setting aside historical and source critical questions. Their work helped lay the foundation for the literary theological study of Tanakh that would later flourish at many institutions, but included among them Yeshivat Har Etzion and Michlelet Herzog, which are, of course, closely associated, or at least associated with Rav Lichtenstein. Rather presciently, he highlights those scholars who aim to unlock the meaning of a biblical passage through its linguistic texture, narrative dynamics, and intertextual resonances, rather than through hypotheses about authorship or redaction. But one thing here seems unclear. If Rav Lichtenstein is applying the approach of New Criticism in his proposed hermeneutics of Tanakh, why does he not invoke that approach by name? Why doesn't he just say, I'm using a New Criticism? To answer this question, it may help to consider Rav Lichtenstein's relation to New Criticism during his time in graduate school. So during the 1950s, Harvard's English department had a diverse faculty. According to Douglas Bush, and we heard about him yesterday a bit, we'll hear a bit more today, the department represented a range of approaches, including historical scholarship, the history of ideas, psychological criticism, and comparative literature. While New Criticism was ascendant in the American South and institutions like Yale, it was by no means the dominant methodology at Harvard. Moreover, Douglas Bush, Rav Lichtenstein's dissertation advisor, was a vocal critic of New Criticism. In a 1948 address to the Modern Language Association, Bush acknowledged the movement's contributions to refining reading skills, but criticized its lack of historical grounding and overemphasis on ambiguity. He also expressed concern that the movement had distanced literature from ethical and moral concerns, favoring complexity over clarity and esotericism over accessibility. In another context, Bush undertook a public debate with Cleanth Brooks over interpretations of Andrew Marvell's poetry, where Bush accused Brooks of distorting historical criticism to fit ideological biases, saying he was trying to be a good modern liberal who hid behind New Criticism in order to deny the apparent reality that a well-balanced mind like Marvell could have admired a ruthless man of action like Cromwell. So given the opposition to New Criticism, which was shared not only by Douglas Bush, but by Rav Lichtenstein's other mentors, such as Perry Miller and Harry Levin as well, it's understandable that Rav Lichtenstein would be cautious about overtly aligning himself with New Criticism. Nevertheless, the movement's interpretive focus on the text offered a fruitful model for rethinking the study of religious texts within a yeshiva framework. While his Harvard mentors urged caution in moving away from historical methods, Rav Lichtenstein may have seen value in a literary approach that could deepen engagement with sacred texts without undermining their religious authority. But Tanakh is not the only area where Rav Lichtenstein advocated for rejecting a historical approach in favor of a focus on the text and its ideas. He put forward a similar approach in describing his methodology for Talmud study, and particularly his advocacy for the Brisker Derech. This method, developed by Reb Chaim Soloveitchik and expanded by his intellectual heirs, emphasizes conceptual distinctions, chakirot, internal coherence, and the focus on the text and the view of the Gemara, the Rambam themselves. Critics have argued that this approach imposes artificial constructs and often ignores the authorial intent. Did the Rambam really mean what Reb Chaim said he meant? But Rav Lichtenstein offered an animated defense of this approach. In a 1984 lecture, Torat Chesed and Torat Emet, that we heard about yesterday and was later published in 2003 in Leaves of Faith, Rav Lichtenstein draws a distinction between two paradigms within the study of Torah. Torat Emet, representing singular objective truth, and Torat Chesed, representing multiplicity, creativity, and human contribution. Core to Torat Chesed is the legitimation of multiple, even contradictory interpretations under the rubric of Elu va'elu divrei Elokim chayim. This is not relativism, but a recognition that the Torah encompasses many perspectives, the proverbial shivim panim per issue, and that sincere application of hermeneutical and logical methods by a qualified sage renders their input as Torah. The tradition affirms a Torah canon that builds on itself, shaped not only by transmission, but by interpretive creation, subject to constraints, yet generative. While Rav Lichtenstein affirms the value of both of these approaches to Torah, he clearly privileges Torat Chesed as the dominant mode of yeshiva study. It is in this space of conceptual exploration and textual richness that he locates the vitality of Talmud Torah. By contrast, Rav Lichtenstein positions the world of academic Jewish studies, which he refers to as Wissenschaft des Judentums, as emphasizing authorial intent and historical development. He associates this historical approach with austerity and monism, and the yeshiva approach with vibrancy and multiplicity. His language here mirrors that of New Criticism, which rejected authorial intent in favor of reader-text interaction and the close analysis of form. Moreover, Rav Lichtenstein explicitly invokes New Criticism here in reflecting on his proposed methodology. He asserts that, and this is a quote, the question of whether a work should be primarily defined, studied, and appreciated with reference to intent and content is, of course, not particular to halacha. The issue served as a focus of controversy within the world of aesthetic and especially literary criticism. It reverberated then through much of the dispute, often acrimonious, between historical and so-called new criticism. However, Rav Lichtenstein argues that the parallel is not as clear as it might seem at first, because Torah is not the same as poetry, and halachists have a particular license to interpret texts, as they play a part in a living tradition of Jewish legal interpretation. Despite these disanalogies, however, it is clear that Rav Lichtenstein is drawing upon New Criticism as he thinks about authorial intent in Lumdus. He even mentions the classical works that debate these issues, such as The Personal Heresy by C.S. Lewis and The Intentional Fallacy by Cleanth Brooks. If we reflect on what we've seen so far, we're left with an unusual fact pattern. Rav Lichtenstein, drawing upon some of the theories of New Criticism that were popular during his time in graduate school, suggests modes of both Bible and Talmud study that similarly focus on studying the text itself and its artistry. However, despite clearly drawing upon these models, Rav Lichtenstein is uncomfortable in doing so explicitly, playing down the role of the influence and pointing to differences in approach in each case. The question thus becomes, once again, but with added force, why did Rav Lichtenstein minimize the parallels between his approach and New Criticism? And if it was simply out of deference to his literary mentors who rejected the method, why use it at all? What appears to emerge is that Rav Lichtenstein embraced a New Criticism style approach, not to literature in general, but particularly to the study of authoritative religious texts. This distinction between different types of literature is, of course, made by Rav Lichtenstein himself, both in his articles on literary hermeneutics and in other writings. He argued for the unique status of religious texts, which are not to be judged by the religious reader. Right? We don't judge the text, but are meant to edify them. You are edified by the text. Rav Lichtenstein frequently related the importance of this stance towards the text when discussing the value of studying Torah, which allows the learner to have a dialogic encounter with the Ribbono Shel Olam and relate to him as commander, as Hashem as the mitzaveh. For the encounter with God and God's Torah, Rav Lichtenstein favors a form of literary analysis that is less focused on historical context and authorial intent, and instead centers the experience with God through the text itself, through its artistry and conceptual beauty. Although this might not be the preferred method in studying other literature, where history should play a more central role, in the realms of Torah and Talmud, the text and its meaning should be centered. Thus, the preference for a focus on the text and the rejection of history in studying the text is not just due to the dangers of biblical criticism or Talmudic criticism, but more so because it distracts from the primary religious goal of studying the text. In fact, while Rav Lichtenstein abandons Douglas Bush's preferred method of historical contextualization of literature here, he does so, meaning in his own writing. If you look at Henry Moore, Henry Moore, it's very much historical criticism. He contextualizes it. Other writings on studying Tanakh and Gemara, there's a move away from history. And although Rav Lichtenstein abandons Bush's approach, his method of historical contextualization, he does so by furthering Bush's goal of making texts relevant sources of ethical instruction to their readers. Bush criticizes the new critics for being overly scientific and detached in their study of literature, seeing it as having only aesthetic value to them. But it's essential for Bush to see texts as having ethical value, to see the ethical value in literature, and to incorporate what one learns from the humanities into one's own life. Rav Lichtenstein, as cited in a 1962 article in the Stern Observer, he's quoted as agreeing with Bush that literature should have ethical implications. And he further asserts that the way that we should study secular literature, it should be to develop those ethical and religious values. But with religious texts, one can accomplish those goals by looking more deeply within the text itself. It's notable that at looking at how Rav Lichtenstein describes the historical versus the textual methods in religious contexts, he actually inverts Bush's characterization of each. Bush put forward a contrast between the dry, valueless, obscure new criticism focused on the text and the broad, morally based, very relevant historical criticism. By contrast, Rav Lichtenstein inverts this. For Rav Lichtenstein, the analog of new criticism, the method that ignores history and focuses on the text and the internal concepts, that is, quote, the teeming Torah Chesed of the yeshiva world in general, and of the Brisker tradition in particular, which is subtle, supple, and luxuriant. Luxuriates in efflorescence, its universe of discourse teeming with burgeoning thought. That's alive, studying the text itself. By contrast, the historically focused world of Wissenschaft focuses on facts, is committed to the hegemony of authorial intent, and is marked by a measure of austerity, critics would say, of aridity. Right? Historical criticism for Rav Lichtenstein is dry, whereas for Douglas Bush, that's actually what's alive and relevant. The roles here have been completely inverted, with historical methods described as being dry and lacking a religious method, while the more text-centered approach is alive, refreshing, and presents an ideal method for the religious student. Thus, in his academic work on Henry Moore, Rav Lichtenstein adheres to historical methods in line with his literary training. However, when addressing Torah, his interpretive goals are fundamentally different, not to historicize, but to encounter the divine, not to evaluate or judge the text, but to be edified by it. We can reinforce this reading in light of another text authored by Rav Lichtenstein that recently came to light, a lecture he offered on the difference between academic and traditional approaches to higher Jewish learning that he presented at YIVO on May 12, 1968, a segment of which was translated and published in 2018. Here, Rav Lichtenstein explicitly connects the approach that values a text religiously and reveres it, he connects that to new criticism. By contrast, Wissenschaft, as an approach, attempts to determine the precise text and its dating, evaluates and judges the text following the historical model of studying literature, and this is not to be adopted by religious texts for Rav Lichtenstein. These nuanced views on the difference between secular and religious literature, which were consistently held over decades of lecturing and writing on these issues, right from 1962 to 1968 to when Torah Chesed and Torah Emet came out in 2003, and the literary article in 2012, throughout the career, consistently held. He relates to, and they relate to both the study of Tanakh and Gemara, reflect how Rav Lichtenstein drew upon his academic training to support Avodat Hashem and his religious worldview. He believed that Torah learning could benefit from the intellectual rigor of literary theory, but only when subordinated to the spiritual and moral aims of religious life. Thus, his engagement with new criticism is selective and purposeful. It serves as a means to illuminate divine truth, not to question or destabilize it. In summation, what role did new criticism play in Rav Lichtenstein's thought? In his approach to secular literature, almost none, as he utilized the historical method following his teacher Douglas Bush. But in his hermeneutics of religious texts, new criticism played an influential role, one he raised when discussing religious interpretation, although he remained circumspect about directly identifying it with the new critical method. The emphasis on close reading, textual autonomy, and formal analysis aligned well with the literary approach to Tanakh and a brisker derech in Talmud study. In Tanakh, this meant literary artistry. In Talmud, conceptual aesthetics, but both were equally ahistorical. Rav Lichtenstein's programmatic articles on this topic are informed by the historicist New Critic debates of the mid-20th century, which he mentions on several occasions, although he avoids ever explicitly embracing the New Criticism label. That avoidance may stem in part from the fact that this was not the approach of his literary mentors, but more deeply from a distinction in Rav Lichtenstein's worldview between religious and secular literature. Religious texts are meant to edify and not be questioned or relativized, and thus one properly focuses on the text itself in a manner akin to New Criticism, which can be described as religious or devotional in tone. Actually, some people talked about New Critics who are not explicitly religious as doing something religious with the text. And that's how Rav Lichtenstein saw religious text should be approached, rather than through historical inquiry. Moreover, Rav Lichtenstein's preference for a text-centered, aesthetically sensitive reading in religious contexts leads him to portray this approach as alive and luxuriant, while presenting the historical Wissenschaft method as dry. Thus, he inverts the stance of his teacher Douglas Bush, who saw historical study as exciting and relevant to modern life, and regarded New Criticism as overly scientific, specialized, and disconnected from the world. This methodological duality reflects Rav Lichtenstein's broader worldview, in which humanistic learning is a means to religious growth, and literary beauty becomes a gateway to spiritual depth. In his landmark article, Torah and General Culture, Confluence and Conflict, Rav Lichtenstein wrote, quote, "Chokhmah can inform and irradiate our spiritual being by rounding out its cardinal Torah component. It effects this either by casting light, if not upon the stuff of Torah proper, its basic texts and concepts, with all their derivatives, then upon the issues to which they relate, or alternatively, by expanding our spiritual and intellectual horizons through exposure to other areas of potential religious import." This examination of some of the chokhmah of mid-20th century literary criticism has hopefully shed light on issues relating to Torah and its hermeneutics, and hopefully expanded our horizons of knowledge around Rav Lichtenstein's approach to studying Tanakh and Gemara as well. Thank you.